Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Withrow, and I'm head of exhibitions and publications at the McMichael. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our virtual curatorial talk with our Chief Curator Sarah Milroy, occasioned by our recently opened exhibition, Gathie Falk, Revelations. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. The McMichael Canadian Art Collection is located on the original lands of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people. It is uniquely situated along the Carrying Place Trail, which historically provided an integral connection for Indigenous people between Ontario's Lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay region. As an institution, the McMichael recognizes the importance of acknowledging the original territories of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe First Nations people and other Indigenous nations. Before we begin tonight's program, I'll say a couple of short things. Those of you who have attended our talks before will be familiar with these, so I will try to keep them brief. Firstly, this talk is being recorded. If you know someone who would love to join us tonight, don't hesitate to send them the link and have them log on. The link should still be open for new joiners, but we will put this talk on our YouTube channel in a few days, so you can always point friends or family there if you think they might like to see what you have seen tonight. Secondly, we have reserved some time at the end for questions for Sarah. So if you have questions during the talk, please put them in the Q&A section or in the chat. I'll gather them up and I will ask Sarah as many as we have time for. Thirdly, I'd like to thank the generous supporters of this exhibition and the accompanying publication. First of all, our presenting sponsor, BMO, Bank of Montreal. Their visionary support has helped us to dream big on many projects, including this one, the biggest of our summer season. So we are ever grateful. Thank you, BMO. Our thanks also to the McMichael Volunteer Committee and the Gathie Falk Circle of Supporters, whose generous contributions were applied to the considerable cost to mount this exhibition. So thank you for your support and your continued faith in us to keep delivering the best of Canadian content to you through the McMichael. And on that note, we love making these talks free to everyone, audiences across Canada and beyond, but we can only do this with supporters of fellow Canadian art lovers. Many of you are probably already in our family of supporters, but if you're not, I hope you might consider joining us. Members get access to all kinds of extra programming, advance notice of things that are going on, and invitations to exclusive occasions. So to become a member, you can go to our website and click the website, click the box marked join. You can also support the McMichael by visiting us. We are open Thursday to Sunday. Tickets are available online in advance and also in the moment on the spot. The gorgeous book that we made to go with this exhibition is another easy way to support the McMichael. This is a gorgeous object in its own right, and something to have and to hold forever and ever. It is available on our on our website through the gift shop website and on site, of course, at McMichael. I suggest that you order it now through the website, have it delivered, peruse before you visit, or come and see the show and make this purchase your dessert. The major essay is by Dinah Algaitis, art historian par excellence, and there are 6 further essays. I'll leave you in suspense of who wrote them all, but let me tell you, it is you won't regret it. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. We're very proud of it. I will introduce and finally hand over to our speaker tonight. Many of you know Sarah Milroy, our Chief Curator, one of this country's most respected public voices and champions of the art of Canada. She has been our fearless leader since 2018, and in those years has curated or co-curated a dozen or more exhibitions at the McMichael, including Uninvited Canadian Women Artists of the Modern Moment, which was a landmark show for us that has been touring the country. It was presented in Calgary at the Glenbow, is now at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and will be headed to the National Gallery of Canada. Sarah also curated all the exhibitions that make up our slate of women artists who are featured this summer and who bookend. So there's Gathie Falk, Revelations, and bookending her exhibition on our platform are Wanda Coop, a wonderful exhibition called Lightworks, and Elizabeth Shulatak, My World. This is a really interesting exhibition and joyful exhibition of large-scale oil stick drawings from Pangnirtung, Nunavut. So please come and visit us. There's so much to see, but we're going to focus our attention tonight on Gathie Falk, the living legend of the West Coast. I can't wait to hear Sarah's insights for tonight and see what she has to show us. Sarah, over to you.
Wonderful, Jen. Thanks so much. Yeah, so it is an incredible summer at the McMichael, actually. All these three women, you know, really people who have stepped out beyond the expectations of what their lives could ever have been, you know, coming from, you know, real difficulty, actually. I hadn't really thought of this until right now, but, you know, all of them very much starting life. I mean, Olympia Schuletak living on the land and having all the trauma of displacement out of that way of life into community life in Pangnirtung and finding her way to art making. Wanda Koop coming from a Ukrainian immigrant family, growing up in Vancouver and later moving to Winnipeg and making her way to be the extraordinary leading figure in painting that she is now in Canada at the age of 70. And Gathie, who you see here at 94, all three of these women are colorists of the highest possible magnitude. Gathie, who you see here, this picture was taken the day that Jen Withrow and I went to Vancouver and made an arrangement to go and see Gathie and show her the book that we had made. And she painstakingly went through every page and looked at every picture and remembered every work and every photograph in a moment that was so warm and wonderful that we ended up cuddling on the sofa. So I've known Gathie since I was about 18 years of age. Many of you know I grew up in Vancouver, and she's one of my favorite humans. And, you know, really the figure that she cuts in Vancouver is kind of like, in a way, it would be like Mary Pratt perhaps in St. John's, Newfoundland, or I'm trying to think of other artists who are like quintessentially, you know, Francois Sullivan in Montreal. Like there's certain female artist figures in this country that kind of become the kind of grandmother of the, you know, of the artists of the generation below them. And that's very much the case with Gathie, which is why it was so lovely in the book to be able to have Liz Magor and Landa McKenzie, two leading artists working in very different mediums, sculpture and painting, talking in the book about what Gathie meant to them and what they even may have learned from her as younger people in the community, looking at her example, not only of her work, but of the way that she worked and of her diligence and of how she presented herself to the art world. And she was, of course, you know, a much storied figure, much beloved, has been showing in Vancouver since the mid 60s, and has had several large museum exhibitions over the course of the years, but nothing for the last 20 years or so ago, and nothing that kind of what we wanted to do at McMichael is to, at the end of Gathie's life, make an exhibition that really distilled down to the essence of her themes and kind of carved away everything that was perhaps not essential to that. And other exhibitions have been more comprehensive, but our desire was to create a kind of a through line that really gave us the core of what it was that she's been trying to do as an artist through the course of her life. And here we see her in her eccentric finery. Early in her life, this picture was probably taken in the 60s or maybe the early 70s. And what you see is she's holding a violin in her hand. And, you know, Gathie's life was, you know, she started out planning to be a musician. And she grew up in a very, very devout Mennonite, Russian Mennonite family in Manitoba. And music was one of the few pleasures that was really sort of sanctioned by the community. And so she played the violin and studied it diligently. She also sang in choirs, and she still does sing in a choir, and she still does go to worship together. I'm not sure during COVID if that's still the case, but these are very central parts of her life, that kind of sacramental ritual as being very much a part of daily life. And as you'll see, it kind of spills over into her art production as well, that sense of giving praise, giving thanks, and upholding the sacred, really, of the everyday. So here's Gathie embarking on her career as an artist, and this is really after 13 years when Gathie was working, as a school teacher. She and her mother moved to Vancouver from Winnipeg. Gathie's father had died when she was very, very young. She and her mother had kind of like floated around making, basically living in people's basements and attics and so on, very, very much indigent, extremely impoverished. They moved to Vancouver, where, Gathie, who you see here on the right-hand side, took up factory work. Here she's working in a packing plant, dry goods packing plant in Winnipeg before the move. But her own education and development as a creative person was really, delayed and delayed and delayed by the need to provide for her mother and for the family. And so, she did these repetitive tasks. And I do believe that they show up when we start looking at her work. You'll see serial reproduction, repetition. These are critical elements of her artistic practice as she goes forward through her life. But it's not really until she moves to Vancouver in 1947. So she's in her 20s with her mother, and she has to make a living. She goes to teachers college. She teaches for 13 years. And then in 1957, which is about 65 years ago now, she starts taking some night courses. She'd been to see a Jack Shadbolt show in Vancouver and had really kind of worked her up. And so she signed up for some night courses, and she studied with such figures as Jock MacDonald and Lauren Harris, who of course was then living in Vancouver, Jacques de Tonnencourt, the Quebec artist. So she was exposed to multiple different approaches to painting. But she sort of started to realize she kind of found her place. And then in 1964, a number of years later, she discovers the medium of ceramics in working with an artist named Glenn Lewis, who would become a very dear friend of hers at UBC. So I'm just going to show you first a few of her. This is a picture of her studio much later in her life in 2016, but it shows, I put it here in the sequence because it shows you the move from factory production to the studio. And, the studio becomes her workplace, really for the rest of her life. After about 1965, she becomes an artist full time. And, Gathie's studio, I had the occasion to be in it numerous times as a young woman, and going all the way through to as recently as, a month or so ago when Jennifer and I were in Vancouver. It's a wonderful place where every single placement of every object is considered, where the juxtaposition of things is tensile with the kind of energy between the things that she puts next to each of the adjacencies, and then all within this kind of creative vortex of the chaos of her making. So here what you're seeing on the wall, this is from 2016, where she'd gone back to painting the pieces of water pictures, which we're going to see later on in the presentation. But, the studio, when she finally had one, became her nirvana, and she has never left it. And she in fact still paints every day or makes sculptural objects. And she's just made a wonderful papier-mâché sculpture of a Mounties uniform with the medals on it, which she's very excited about. And the idea for doing a Mounties uniform came from the uniform of one of her, I'm remembering it to be a nephew or perhaps a godson. I think it's a nephew of hers who was in the service, and she was very impressed by his uniform. And so she's still looking at the world and figuring out, what to select from it to kind of memorialize or venerate in some way. So what we're looking at here is a very early, very raw, very interesting painting by Gathie called Crucifixion of 1966. So it's one of her early paintings, and you can see these figures arranged around the outside. These are the onlookers to the crucifixion. And of course, the crucifix, is a time-honored theme in Christian art. So here we're going back to the wellspring of her Christian belief system, but it's presented in a way that is very visceral and really rather disturbing. The Christ figure here looks kind of like a hunk of meat or something that's, in the back of the butcher shop. This grotesque quality to it, which is really quite extraordinary. I think this picture is very important in Gathie's work. You can already see the amazing color sense. And this is actually the first work you see when you walk into the gallery. Now, we're not certain that this work has been shown publicly before, but, we think it's a kind of a decoder ring in a way to the whole body of work, because it does go to this idea of the sacramental. and you know, it allies with her deepest belief systems. There are other paintings in the show as well from this period, and again, they deal with the fullness of life. This is like the banquet, you know, and what you see along with these paintings when she switches from paintings to ceramics, as she does, you know, when she starts to make the fruit piles, she at first makes ceramic vessels like teapots and jugs and so on. They never look quite right. They're always quite wonky and not quite utilitarian. But then at a certain point, she breaks through in 1967 and starts making these fruit baskets and fruit piles, which are among her most beloved works. And when you look at them, you can see that she's, you know, as she will confess, that she was inspired by walking down the street and seeing, you know, fruit piles in the windows of grocery stores. And she simply excises from this experience of the everyday and, you know, creates these kind of very geometric forms of objects that are, each one is distinct, like each one is in a slightly different stage of ripeness or decomposition in some cases. Some of them feature rotting fruit. So time is there in these sculptures, even from the very beginning. But you know, you can also see, as Liz Magor does, looking at these sculptures, that she's in a way pushing back a little bit against the kind of process art and art, you know, counting art and these kinds of preoccupations of conceptual art that were very fashionable at the time among artists who were not making objects, or who were making objects that simply referred to systems and counting and so on, and quantification. So, I mean, these are about that, but with all the lushness of life. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about Klaes Oldenburg, who's an American pop artist who I think is a real soulmate to Gathie, because, you know, Oldenburg, like Gathie, makes works that are seemingly innocent, seemingly whimsical, but that actually step up to and engage with all the kind of artistic trends of the period that took themselves the most seriously, and which perhaps Gathie, like Oldenburg, saw it as her mission, perhaps, to bring them down to earth a little bit, as she does. So, but you know, you don't need to know all that to love these, and that's the beauty of Gathie's work, is you can enjoy this as a pile of glossy fruit, or you can start to think about the history of art in the mid 20th century and actually how she was inserting herself into that narrative. They're very, you know, she was very aware. The Vancouver Art Gallery in this period, the mid 60s and 70s in Vancouver, was a real hotspot in Canada. Artists in Vancouver were being exposed to a lot of breaking news from New York. They were being exposed to performance art, as we've seen, to experimental film. They were being exposed to minimalism and conceptual art from California. There was quite a bit of traffic between museums in California, for example, and those in Vancouver. There was a very advanced art dealer named Doug Christmas who ran the Douglas Gallery, which also showed such figures as, you know, Rauschenberg and Warhol at the time, who were coming up to Vancouver, being interviewed by the press. And, you know, I'm still convinced that one of the reasons that Gathie never answers a question when she's interviewed is because she observed Warhol's technique of refusing to define his works in verbal terms. Works of art were visual ideas. And Warhol would kind of make subtle mockery of his interviewees when he would, or interviewers, when they would ask questions that asked to explain the art. And his responses were always kind of like, look at what's in front of you. You know, like he refused to sort of reduce the visual to language, because so much is lost in translation. There are ideas that are simply visual ideas. And I think that's something that Gathie understood really, really well, as do most truly wonderful artists. So we can see here that Gathie is in the terrain of a great tradition. Also, in addition to being apprised of the art of her time, she's looking at classic surrealism, which she would have been well aware of from her studies and just from her own inquisitive nature. So here's Salvador Dali's Lobster Telephone of 1936, which is, of course, this sublime kind of confection of two things that don't go together, but we'll see lots of that in the sculptures of Gathie Falk. Or Merritt Oppenheim's My Nurse, which is a wonderful, you know, upended high heels with the lamb cutlet papers stuck on the ends of them. Again, a very tartly feminist work that kind of, you know, refuses the notion of women as delectables, I would say, and asserts a kind of acerbic wit to that paradigm. She was also very aware, Gathie, of American pop art in addition to French surrealism. And she would have been very well aware of Jasper John's painted bronze beer cans that were in a way a kind of exaltation of the very most everyday thing, which is an old can of beer. And, you know, John's made many works of this sort over the course of his career. She would also been aware of Marilyn Levine, who was a Canadian artist who had sort of migrated down to California and stayed in the US. But Levine made a number of sculptures that were based on shoes and boots. And they were, again, very scruffy and beat up works by the looks of them. But of course, when you touch them, they're rock hard ceramic. So, you know, an incredible artist of the trompe-l'oeil. And you'll see when Gathie gets to the making of shoes and boots, there's no real effort to have them be mistaken for the real thing. So she sees an idea about making something, but she doesn't copy it. She completely makes her own way with it. So these were just the kind of things that she would have been seeing in the California funk ceramic movement. That was, again, there were these arteries, these conduits of knowledge up and down the coast with artists traveling up and down and residencies and exhibitions. So she was swimming in a very rich broth of ideas. And, you know, this is a classic, you know, work of Gathie's, the floating cabbages. Here it is being shown at the Vancouver Art Gallery, but we've reconstituted 22 or 24, I can't remember, of these cabbages to float in our galleries. And they float surrounded by paintings in a room that is really pretty breathtaking when you walk into it. Each one is installed on its own string. And Eric Pearson, our exhibition designer, and I had a wonderful time, you know, playing with the installation. We kind of started at one corner and like, this one needs to go up and that one goes down. And we just kind of worked our way across the room, trying to make something to look random. And that's actually very hard. It's much easier to make something to look all buttoned up. But when you try to make something look accidental, like a whole bunch of cabbages start floating to the ceiling, it's quite challenging, but we had a wonderful time doing it. And the effect is really extraordinary. But again, the cabbage, you know, which is a favorite vegetable of Gathie's, you know, the cabbage is a staple of Mennonite cooking. It's particularly a staple of Mennonite low budget cooking, which would certainly have been, you know, what Gathie would have been exposed to growing up. And again, in her later years with her mother cooking in Vancouver, you know, it's cheap and it's filling and it goes a long way. That's also very good for you. But, you know, it's wholesome in that way that would be typical of Mennonite cookery. So, you know, it's the most ordinary, other than the potato, perhaps, it's sort of the most earthy, cheap, you know, down to earth vegetable. This ain't a zucchini, you know, or some kind of fancy, you know, squash blossom. This is about as low on the scale of, you know, hoity toity as you can get. And it, to me, it's very, it speaks a lot to Gathie's values that this is the vegetable that she wants to really venerate over and over again. Gathie was also a pioneer of performance art. And so we have a special gallery devoted to her work, Red Angel, which was first performed in 1972. And then the video was made with the assistance of the Vancouver artist Hank Bull, who was the cameraman, in 1977. And Hank writes about the experience of shooting this performance for our book, which is wonderful. He's one of the several wise elders who we have pulled into this publication to reflect on Gathie in her glory days. And what happened in this performance, just to tell you very quickly, is that Gathie makes this appearance with this wedding dress on, or white bridal dress, or angel dress, or whatever, however you take it to be, depending on how you look at it. It's a little bit indeterminate, with the wings. So we're leaning towards the angel interpretation. But partway through, she climbs up on the armwear, and then she stands up and removes the bridal dress, angel dress, to reveal a more kind of a satiny, kind of a blue-gray, more of a siren type of a dress that's underneath it. And as she is, you know, in the process of this whole revelation of herself, she's also these turntables down below, which we've just had reshot, but all of this has been wonderfully fixed up and conserved by the Art Gallery of Ontario, who were wise enough to buy all of these sets and the video as well. They fixed it all up to be included in our show and did just an absolutely spectacular job of it. So, many thanks to the AGO for that. But on these turntables, the apple with the parrot on top would have, and the parrots, by the way, she found in a secondhand store, and that's kind of in Vancouver, out in the East End. That's kind of where the whole thing started from. But the apples and parrots would revolve, and then the cast, including Gathie, would sing in a roundel, row, row, row your boat. So they're all coming in at different times in the round, and the parrots are going around. I mean, it is, and then Gathie takes off the wedding dress, and then her partner Elizabeth Klassen comes and comes squeaking across the set with a hand washing machine with a wringer, and takes the wedding dress and starts washing the wedding dress. And so there's ivory snowflakes that are going in, and it's being washed. And so there's this kind of conflation of, the woman as the kind of bride angel, the woman as the siren or the kind of, something much more elegant. And then the washerwoman, there's all these different sort of paradigms of femininity, which is how I look at this piece very much. And it's worth noting, I think, if you ask Gathie these questions, she's like, oh no, I wasn't thinking about that at all. But, I wonder also, the apple is also very much associated with the story of Eve, and the parrot very much associated in French painting with the figure of the prostitute. So, we will never know, because we will never get a straight answer from Gathie to what extent she was mindful of these allusions. But taken together, it makes up a sort of symphonic investigation into the feminine. And you'll see that she makes other runs at that subject matter as we move through the slides tonight. Gathie also performed a series of picnic performances, which she and her colleague would perform in front of, Tom Graff was his name, would perform in front of a bank or inside the Vancouver Art Gallery, in front of a sculpture by George Siegel. And that particular sculpture was of dead people lying around, made out of papier-mâché. So she's getting the green astroturf out and setting up her picnic and having little cakes and teas and sandwiches, in front of something that, taking space within the museum, and really stepping up to another tradition of making, and a kind of tradition that was associated with sort of extreme currency with like world events and social and political issues and so on. So there's a way in which she kind of is an upstart who's kind of challenging the what would I say, the given profundities of contemporary art. And she also does this performance in front of a bank on the front steps. She does it all over the place. She even does it in a park, God help us. So these performances were very inspiring for her. And we have a slideshow. It was originally shown in a slide carousel, but we can't do that anymore because the slide carousel would explode after 8 hours of play. So we're projecting it instead, but you can see all the iterations of the picnic sculptures in the show. And, she also became, here they are in front of the bank. And I just love the kind of beatific smiles, in the sense of being profoundly at their ease. And you can see the little clock that's in the front, this element of timekeeping. And also it certainly suggests, life is a picnic or life is no picnic, taking a moment of everyday life and charging it with something special, noticing moments of everyday life. These are all themes that are very important to her. So after she, quite a while after she'd finished making these picnic performances, she revisited the picnics and she made these sculptures. I'll just show you a few of them, but we have many in the show, which have this block of astroturf motif, but upon which she puts these very improbable configurations. And sometimes they're a little bit on the eerie side, as you can see here. This is a dog. This to me feels like, Cerberus, like guarding the gates of hell or something. When you see him, Gathie was perfectly capable of making an appealing puppy. She had an appealing puppy herself who was always at her side. This is not what she's chosen to do here. This looks like maybe a statuary that would be guarding, a tomb or something like that. But she conjoins it with this sort of floral tribute, again, associated perhaps with funerary practices or with grave sites. So before we go on, I just want to read something which I just came across today, and I thought, Scott Watson, who for many years ran the Morris and Helen Belkin Art Center at UBC, and before that was a complete renegade and marvelous curator at the Vancouver Art Gallery for many years. But he wrote of Gathie, "There's been little attempt to interpret Falk's work in light of her beliefs, her religious beliefs. Instead, there is an image of Falk as a surrealist of good vibes, a funky, bizarre artist for whom play and the recreation of her childhood are her most serious concerns. Much of her popularity is based on the mistaken idea that she is a master of whimsy. The charm she gives to an image or an object have hidden from us a darker aspect to her work. Her obsession with shiny, sticky surfaces, which you'll see in her paintings coming up, the chaos of many compositions, and the emphasis on organic processes of decay and regeneration, as well as many metaphorical allusions to death, such as this, I would argue, all point to ongoing thematic concerns which expand the veneration of the ordinary, quote unquote, into something with cultural and mythic implications." So I think he's right. I mean, I think because Gathie's work is so beautiful and so full of sort of effulgence and fertility, and there's this sort of celebratory feeling to it, you can miss the fact that this is actually kind of a rather severe looking animal. And when you come around the side of it, if you come to see the show, you'll see his haunches are quite gaunt and gamey. It does not look like a dog you would stick your hand out to without checking first. Likewise, her little picnic with clock and tulips, you can see, time's swift passage is certainly alluded to by the clock. And then the tulips are just kind of, they're just collapsing a little bit because, of course, we know flowers are the ultimate emblem of the memento mori, of the passage of time, the fragility of life and beauty. So these are very much themes that, are consciously, I believe, consciously embedded in Gathie's work. And, with regard to, showing foodstuffs or showing, objects like the flowers or the dog, I'm very reminded of Oldenburg, who I mentioned before. And, here you'll see a food sculpture, which we'll get to in a minute, by Gathie, the pink salmon with the blue ribbon. And we also have a painting in the show which deals with those same themes. But the elevation of food, as we have in the fruit piles, I mean, Oldenburg was right at the epicenter of American pop art. And so he was surrounded by artists such as Rauschenberg, Rosenquist, Dine, Warhol, who were professing, for the most part, a kind of hard and shiny Americana. And Warhol's soup cans or Brillo boxes look like commercial products. It's as if Oldenburg, like Gathie, is kind of stepping up to that orthodoxy of the American sublime of like products and material culture, material consumer culture, and positing something kind of more artisanal, handmade, perhaps slightly, detumescent, slightly flattened, and in that way more vulnerable and more human. And I feel that they have a kind of a kindred stance in relation to pop art. So I've mentioned this picnic with fish and ribbon before, and there are several. There's a picnic with lemons in the show, and several others featuring food. And again, the fish is one of the oldest Christ symbols that there is, and in this sculpture, tied up with the bow, it's a gift. Here, the fish are tied with a bow as well, but beside it is also a bowl of eggs, which is a fertility symbol. So it's all, to me, it seems very clear that these works are about the gifts we are given and the fullness of the world. But they also carry within them this kind of, often this kind of reminder of the cycles of time. And you'll see that becomes a very big theme, particularly towards the end of her life. The theater in black and white and color pictures. Here you see the kitchen chairs. And in this whole series, she's either making a painting and then a shadow version of it, and we'll see that, or she's making a painting that has a kind of shadow world leaning away from it in the form of these shadows, which are they're very much highlighted within the composition. There's a kind of one geometry going that way, and there's another geometry going that way. And the shadows really have a lot of presence. So to me, there's a kind of life and death, you know, parlay going on between the painted forms and the shadows of them. And you'll see, you know, in other cases, there are pairings like this with its twin, which is brightly colored. Again, we see the string of fish across the top in both paintings, you know, a really important religious symbol, but also just sort of a symbol of fertility, really, as are these wonderful flowering bushes, which I think are little miniature rose bushes, which she did love very much. She painted them many, many times. Also equally epiphanic, like an epiphany, are her pieces of waterworks. And what's interesting, I think, about these is, like Monet's Giverny paintings, she rises up above the water surface and immerses us in it visually. There's no horizon line here. We have no idea where we could possibly be physically in relation to this scene. Obviously, the light source from the sky is in the upper left-hand quadrant, and the current seems to be coming down and towards the right, bottom right corner, with ever deepening shades of blue as we move towards the bottom right corner. But it's actually in disembodied gaze. We unless you're, you know, hang gliding over a patch of water, this is not a view of water that most of us will see. Perhaps if we're diving off a dock in the middle of the summer, we might see something like this. But each of these works are, you know, really immersions in beauty and in light. But to be immersed in light is to be immersed in the ephemeral as well. And each of these works is titled with a story that she was listening to on the CBC on the radio in her studio while she was working. So this one is called El Salvador, others are called Nicaragua, one's called Royal Wedding, one's called 10% Wage Freeze, one of the ones in our show. So, I mean, by and large, most of them have titles that allude to historical events that are occurring, which are involving wars or human suffering. And again, El Salvador would be an example of this at this period in 1982. And again, I think it goes very deeply to Gathie's pacifist beliefs. And as a Mennonite, that was absolutely central to her. And she actually sponsored a number of new Canadians to come to Canada, mostly from Vietnam, over the course of her life, and very actively working with her church to do these you know, to make possible for people to come to this country from wherever they were feeling unsafe at the time. So there is, I think, a lovely parallel, again, to go back to Monet, who made his water lilies as Giverny as the war in the trenches was taking place, you know, right at the bottom of the village. I mean, some of the fields where the battles were taking place were so close that the windows in Monet's studio would shake with the bombardments, but he refused to leave and sort of said, if those butchers want to come and kill me in my studio, they'll, you know, they can come and do so, but I'm not stopping. So, you know, Gathie is a strong person, a productive person, but also a person who feels the darkness of the world very deeply, and who's a very sensitive soul. So, you know, these stories would have been very deeply affecting to her. And I look at the making of these paintings as really kind of a sort of medicine for herself. They're exquisitely beautiful, there are a number of them. Likewise, her flower border and lawn paintings, which she made several different iterations of, and we've just been able to pull together several of them in the show at the McMichael, but we feel they're the most glorious. And it's really her backyard. And if you go to visit Gathie Falk, who lives in East Vancouver, you will probably be able to pick out the street or pick out the house on the, if you know the street, because the garden comes down the hillside to the sidewalk, and then it jumps the sidewalk and continues onto the boulevard where you know, everyone can enjoy it. So I think that democratic impulse to provide beauty for everyone in the neighborhood, that is also very much Gathie. But she's very, very fond of her garden. It is really, in many ways, a parallel work of art, and she works on it with her partner Elizabeth, and it has all sorts of rituals, social encounters and groups that come to be there with her, less so now that she's more advanced in years. But the garden has always been a very important place for her. And of course, the garden is a very central biblical theme as well. So, you know, in some cases, as Scott Watson wrote in that piece of text I read, the surfaces are very sticky, almost caramelized. as if the color is kind of like oozing out of the canvas surface in ways that are almost overwhelming to look at. They're sweet, beyond sweet, into kind of super saccharine and deeply sensuous. And you can see a little bit of the pavement starting to come up here. She doesn't edit. She would make these panels so that, as if in a sort of cinematic way, as if the camera was moving across and capturing different aspects of the border of flowers. But these cement with poppies, definitely drawn from her marvelous real life. And so too the cement with grass. This is another series, I think there's 7 or 8 of them. And just simply looking, okay, flowers, it's easy to make those beautiful, but how do we make a piece of concrete that, not everyone can have gardens and flowers. What does everyone have? Everyone has the sidewalk under their feet. So, she starts painting cement, and she creates these layers and layers and layers of color that tease up this beautiful, depth to what you're looking at. And again, I'm reminded of Monet with his Rouen cathedrals. It's a loftier subject for sure, but he paints that rocky surface of the cathedral under every conceivable light effect, as does Gathie with the cement paintings. And it's a marvelous series, and of course, highly experimental. And, I think evidence that Gathie was guided in her life by the internal logic of her paintings to the next series. She was always working through problems and going on to the next thing. And even if it meant that next thing would be a series of paintings that perhaps wouldn't be as attractive, say, to art collectors. In fact, the cement paintings have done rather well. But, she would just kind of continue with that trajectory, scratching her own painterly itch to try and challenge herself and do something new. So speaking of scratching an itch, Gathie had a very brief and ultimately disappointing interlude as a wife. She married a man that she met through a program where inmates in prison could correspond with people to develop their writing skills or, start to strategize about life outside of jail. When this man came out of jail, they got married, and very quickly it became clear that this was a very exploitative situation for her. And ultimately he was actually convicted again and went back to jail, which was probably a bit of a relief for her, Gathie. But several years after that marriage was over and done with, she made this very enigmatic work called, well, it doesn't look enigmatic to me at all, but she refuses to explain it. She says the problem with wedding veils, that the rocks are on the back of the wedding veil so that the bride doesn't fall over. And more than that, she really will not say, but I think it is quite clearly a meditation on matrimonial duty, and even on the kind of, equation between, the benefits of security, stability versus the longing for freedom that are part of the negotiation of marriage, of any marriage. And it's a marvelous work of art. It is still not currently in a museum collection. So, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I think probably her consummate feminist statement as an artist. And again, she's not an artist that would kind of probably label herself a feminist, but she's certainly expected to be treated as an equal. And there's a wonderful story that a friend of mine told me about being on a jury with her, where she was on a Canada Council jury, and she was surrounded by a bunch of men, and she was the one woman jurist, and they were all bloviating to such an extent that after a couple of days of being on the road with them, she just said, "I'm going home. I can't take any more of this." But it was like done in such a way, and it was like, you all have a problem. And this is not how I want to talk about art or think about art or dismiss people that have different orientations towards art than myself. But she always managed to, if she had a film crew that was coming in to do something with her, and they, there was, Landa McKenzie tells the hilarious story about the film crew going to visit Gathie and them asking her if she ever regrets not having had children. And apparently she threw the film crew out of her studio and said, "Don't come back. Like that, I'd rather not be in the film. Like, this is who are you people?" And so, to me, that's a feminist, but, she's not one for labels or for explaining things. So there are many mysteries. One of the more delightful groups of Gathie's works. And again, the show is all organized around these key themes. some of which repeat at different times in her career as well. So it's not really, strictly speaking, a chronological hang by any means. But the shoes and boots, I think, have a special, very central place in Gathie's work, because they speak to her love of the humble and the everyday. Like these red boots, each one has been individually made. She's showing the inside of the right boot, which is, she says, is a more vulnerable part of the body. It denotes a more interior, tender, intimate space of the foot, the instep. And all of these boots are very weather beaten. They're not made to look shiny and new the way that, say, Andy Warhol's famous shoe drawings are, where everything looks brand new and dazzling and gorgeous. These have been worn, they've been weather beaten, and the zippers look like they may or may not work. But, you know, again, she claims to have made these, from looking at boot displays and shoe displays in shoe stores, like walking around in her neighborhood. But I think there's an obvious reliquary reference to the way that these boots are presented. And also, you know, I find it hard to believe that she's not aware of the history of art, both recent and more historic art, which had dealt with the shoe as a subject in art, always with a view to exploring, humanity's most fundamental aspects. So, Van Gogh's shoes, from the 1880s, something that's obstructing my view here. So I think it's 80, oopsie, sorry, hold on a sec. I think it is 88, 1888. He did a number of studies of shoes that were working people's shoes, often, potato pickers or other workers that he was in close quarters with. He could see that in the shoe is the life. When you look at the shoe, you can see the kind of life that's being worn. You can see the effort, you can see the weather, you can see time going by. And, they are sort of, in a way, our most human part. The feet is where we connect with the ground. It's where we're all the same. So it had that allure for Van Gogh. It also had that allure for Philip Guston, the great American artist, who uses the shoe with the sole, with the nails in it, over and over and over again compulsively in his pictures. And he's arguing, again, like Gathie is, I think, in a way, a very democratic take on American public life. He of course, famously pilloried the Ku Klux Klan in his paintings and addressed, racial injustice and, the depravity of the Richard Nixon administration and all, Vietnam, all sorts of issues of the day were confronted by Guston. But he goes back and back to this motif of the shoe, and particularly the soul. If I was a Freudian psychologist, I would say, the soul and the soul, the S-O-L-E and the S-O-U-L are kind of, they're one and the same in these shoe paintings by Van Gogh and by Guston, and indeed, I think also by Gathie. So you'll see these are looking a bit spiffier than the red shoes, but when you look at them, you can see very much that they have been worn. And this is a kind of paean to Elizabeth Klassen, her partner. These are her ankles, her little black shoes. Repeated again and again. And here you see again this idea of serial repetition, repeating the work again, like the fruit piles, or like working through all the series of picnic sculptures. You start with something, or the shoe sculptures themselves, and you repeat it and you wring from it every possible permutation of meaning. So this is the beautiful work, the red shoe with the kind of garland of flowers draped over the toe that you'll see at the beginning of the exhibition when you arrive, one of her most beautiful creations. So it's all about, taking the lowliest of objects, a beat up old shoe, and elevating it, like we did with the cabbage, to make it something that is deserving of veneration. The last gallery of the show is devoted to a series of Gathie Falk's night sky paintings. And, they are truly, truly wonderful. She starts making them in the late 70s, and she makes a series of pictures, of city skies. So you can really see when you look at this is no Tom Thompson night sky. This is lights illuminated, clouds that are illuminated by artificial light in the city, which gives to clouds, and you'll all recognize this from your own experience, but it gives the clouds a kind of amber tone. And particularly if you're flying into a city from somewhere else, you'll see that the clouds will look kind of orange. And, you know, she captures that very much. But the inspiration for the night skies, here's another beautiful one of a cloudless night sky. And you'll see if you look at this, that while the heavens themselves look kind of mottled and like they have depth, and you can see that there's layers and layers and layers of blue and aqua and green tint in those depths. But the actual stars themselves are quite, you know, they are a symbol of a star as much as they are an evocation of what an actual star looks like in the sky. An actual star doesn't look like it has 5 points to it. But, you know, where this idea is coming from is from a very deep experience that she had of the Arena Chapel in Padua in Italy, where Giotto's famous fresco cycle of the life of Christ is around on all the walls. But the canopy of that wonderful chamber is blue with all these equidistant stars. So it's clearly a decorative motif. The stars are not painted on the ceiling to look like the actual constellations or anything like that. It's just really a decorative ensemble. And she seems to have been, you know, deeply affected like that by that. And of course, as a practicing Christian who was very, very devout, the experience of seeing the Arena Chapel would have been a transformational one. And indeed, she goes back to the night skies again, much later on in her life. This is from 2016. This is the last work that we see in the show, or one of the last works that we see in the show. But again, going back to the night skies, but with a more sort of visceral, punchy application of paint, and these, you know, razzle dazzle stars are, you know, like much less subtle, much, you know, much louder and more insistent. And I take that to be a kind of indication of the energy with which she is sort of meeting the subject matter now, at the, you know, very much towards getting towards the end of her life. And a kind of, you know, I see it as a kind of like raging against the dying of the light myself, I must say. And there's something very fierce about these late paintings. And you can see that we've installed in the middle of that gallery of night skies, we've installed this very haunting and ghostly, beautiful sculpture of a white empty vessel of a dress that appears to be just simply floating away on us. This has come to us from the Art Gallery of Alberta, and we're deeply grateful for this wonderful loan. She's all by herself, floating amid the stars, right where she belongs. And, you know, Gathie made a number of works. You know, later on in her career of garments, she made a lot of single men's shirts and ties, things to do with office work, which was a theme that always interested her, right back to her ceramic cycle, Veneration of the White Collar Worker, which she made for a public building in Ottawa, you know, much, much earlier in her career. But we chose these two dress sculptures because I think they represent the high point of the garment work. So there's this one and this other one named Lizzie, which is memorializing a friend of hers who had died, and made in 2002. So these are about as different as they can be. This one looks like this lighter than air floating figure. And this one is this kind of hunk of carbon. It's like the remains of, you know, the remains of a life. And it's very dense and dark. And I absolutely love the way in the show, if you come into the show from the back, you see this sculpture here in connection with this heavenly body, moon and three stars, which again is a kind of dark orb that feels kind of like you know, elemental media out of which the universe is constellated. It's like the most rudimentary forms of matter that we can contemplate, that we can evoke in a work of art. So I think it makes a very powerful conclusion to the show. And I think it also, you know, creates what we wanted to do, is create this arc of a life from the fruit piles and the banquets and the bride and the flowers and the pieces of water and the picnics and the, you know, the clocks with the flowers, you know, starting to wilt, through to the, you know, the signs of aging and wear in the shoe sculptures, and onward through into the night skies, and this floating ghostly figure, and then this kind of hunk of carbon at the end. It really is a story of Gathie's life as an artist, but it really is a story of all of our lives as human beings, from the richness of youth to something more perhaps condensed and wiry and elemental as we get towards the end. But I mean, clearly, you know, Gathie is looking, you know, with a strong faith, but looking towards the beyond, and thinking about the universe and its possibilities. More and more, she's returned to this theme in later years alongside her spiffy new Mountie. She's also thinking about these themes and, thinking about them in ways that are entirely her own. And she just has such a remarkable creative mind and so much going her own way. I think that part of what resonates for younger artists when they look at Gathie is just the determination she was a Mennonite girl. They're not supposed to do things like this. They're supposed to get married and have babies and learn how to make great food and, be dutiful and go to church. She maintained her faith throughout, but she very much, again, Wanda Coop was also in our gallery this summer, also, raised as a Mennonite, and there were certain things that girls did not do. Wanda originally wanted to be a dancer, and that was absolutely unthinkable. These are women who, Elizabeth, grew up on the land, in a hunting, gathering, living in nomadic, homes, following the animals and the seasons. These are women that probably never thought that they would be able to have these kind of operatic opportunities for expression in their lives as visual artists. And they're all three of them so extraordinarily remarkable. And it's wonderful to have Gathie as our leading lady at the McMichael this summer. We're going to have her with us all through the fall as well. So, please come and see us. Please bring your friends, bring your grandchildren, bring your children, bring your grandmother, and be with us, because the gallery just feels so light and full of life right now. We are really enjoying sharing it with the public, and people are just actually in raptures when by the time they get to the end of it, they feel they've had a great workout in their mind, but also in their spirit. And that's just about as good as, that is the stuff that makes us really happy at the McMichael, and we feel we've been able to offer something like that to the public, particularly at a time when we're all maybe needing to regroup a little and pull ourselves back up, after a very long and difficult time that we've all been through. And we're so sorry that Gathie was not able to travel to the McMichael at 94. Her nearest and dearest thought it was unwise, but we know that she's with us in spirit, and she'd be so thrilled, and is so thrilled, to think that the exhibition is getting this wonderful and kind attention so close to Toronto in our very own Kleinburg.
Sarah, thank you so much.
My great pleasure.
There are no questions in the chat.
Uh-oh.
I think people were in raptures, and there are expressions of enthusiasm and gratitude, and but no questions. I have one question. Yes. That I thought I might ask.
Please.
About the title of the exhibition.
Well, we went through a bunch of different iterations. At first, we were going to call it Gathie Falk Themes and Variations, because Gathie started her life as a musician, and of course, themes and variations is, from a musical motif, means, you do it, then you do it again slightly differently, then you do it again slightly differently again, and sometimes you come back to the beginning again and do it the way you did it before. That's very much the way that Gathie works. But I think our feeling was that themes and variations sounded a bit, I don't know, academic, or like this was going to be work. And so there was a title in between before we got
to All Together Now.
Oh yeah, we thought All Together Now.
All Together Now.
Yeah, we thought
the idea of a choir,
Yeah, All Together Now, and also the fact that with the I forgot about that one because of the the kind of the Carnaby Street vibe of the fruit piles and the funky boots and stuff, that it would feel like All Together Now is such a boisterous song by the Beatles that it would kind of like give people a sense of how the show is going to make you feel when you look at it. And the Beatles are also like so quirky, like their language and the lyrics and the way that they mix the sounds of the music that they do. But then that sort of, to me, started to feel like In the All Together, which is about like being in the nude. And I thought, well, maybe this is going to be, maybe not everyone knows the Beatles as well as we do, and maybe they might think that was a bad idea. And then there was another one too, Jen, and you probably can remember. We got to Revelations because we had another title in between that was kind of had an ecclesiastical cast to it, because we thought we wanted to give a sense of this idea of the sanctity of the everyday, and the kind of, sacredness of, you remember it?
Yeah, no, but Brittany is in the audience and she just texted me to say it was offerings. Thank you,
Offerings.
Brittany.
Yes. Thank you,
That was a
Britt.
good one.
Yeah, offerings was a good one too, because now we're getting closer, because it was the senses of the sacramental. And it was also, it spoke to the generosity of Gathie's work. But then somehow in the middle of the night, revelations floated into my head. And I thought, it's perfect, because there is something apocalyptic. Of course, the Book of Revelations is about a kind of an afterworld of apocalypse, but it has really beautiful imagery in it that is sometimes beautiful and sometimes disturbing. And also, of course, there's the plain straightforward meaning of the word revelations is that something is, a huge pleasure to regard. You're learning something, and that we hoped also that, we would be creating a revelation here in the show, in the way the show was organized and phased through these very specific bodies of work, that it would be a revelation even to people that knew Gathie's work very well, to see the kind of through lines that we were defining. So we're hoping to make the show a revelation even for people who are, well versed in Gathie's work. But of course, many, many people in Eastern Canada do not know Gathie Falk's work. So the show is truly a revelation for probably 90% of our viewers who are coming into the gallery and saying, how do we not know about this incredible artist who has all these, she's a incredible painter, incredible ceramic artist, what the first performance artist in Canada, makes the earliest video art piece in Canada, arguably, like all these different media. And yet, her name is kind of, sotto voce in the story of Canadian art. So we hope we have played the trumpet nice and loud for her with this show. And it will be touring on to Museum London, and then to Calgary at the Glenbow, and finally on to the Audain Art Museum in Whistler, so back in her home province of British Columbia. So, we will be creating revelations, we hope, for many of our fellow Canadians all across the country as the show tours.
We have one question from an eminent art historian that I would like to ask you. But before I do, I just want to quickly say that this book is full of wonderful photos of Gathie throughout her life. And I think that's one of the most special things about this book. And the photo on the back, I see this work, this photo, and I just want to know what is in her mind.
Yes.
I think this is
Michael Tarosian, the great Canadian photographer, took that picture and many decades ago now. But, even though she's much older now, you get that sense of well, first of all, the hands in that photograph, there's such a sense of someone who is committed to making things, and this was in an era when, when conceptual art and anti-object was all the, the order of the day. And pop art, you had your studio make the work or whatever. Gathie is a maker. And I think those hands that Michael captures, but then also that look in her eyes of just, deep attention and maybe a little bit of shyness, but, also kind of appraisal, that she's not, a sweet little old lady. She's like really sizing you up there and keeping, taking her, remaining on guard. It shows, I think, so many aspects of her personality, and we're so grateful to Michael Tarosian for sharing that image with us for our back cover. It's really a great.
I love this photo so much, and just photos of her throughout the book, making art and doing performances and just being herself is, I think, one of the joys of this book. There are many. Okay, I'll ask you this question.
Yes.
Could Gathie have found an art scene equally welcoming and stimulating anywhere else in Canada than Vancouver, with its West Coastness, flower power, rebellion against norms?
Interesting. I think she was ideally suited to make this body of work in the West Coast. And I think that there's a way in which this work comes out of the West Coast because of the kind of, because of the counterculture, because of, as you say, flower power, because of the kind of chaotic love of the kind of chaotic natural world, because of its closeness to, Bay Area funk, ceramics, and West Coast culture more generally. The funk ceramics had a real, Robert Arneson et al., had a real edge of kind of Dadaist, Dadaism mixed with a kind of strong pleasure principle. And I think, I don't know if someone who delivers so much pleasure in their art could have been taken seriously in, for example, flinty old Toronto, in the 1960s and 70s. I think that there's a kind of lushness to Gathie that allowed her to have all the pleasure in her work, but also be taken seriously as an artist. And to be taken seriously was to be given encouragement, to be encouraged by her public and her fans. And as I say, Gathie is a figure in Vancouver that is beloved, in a way that I would think a Mary Pratt would be in Newfoundland. She's seen as a core figure in the city's sense of identity. But I would love to know who this speaker is, to know, if they have any further thoughts on this, because it could be very interesting.
I think she knows how to reach you. So,
yeah, yeah, wonderful. But I think Gathie was in the perfect place. I mean, maybe Winnipeg could have actually tolerated a figure like this, because there is this, you see it rear again in the kind of Royal Art Lodge. There is this kind of, this kooky thing in Winnipeg with the people that are calling down the spirits and, spiritualists and all that. Like there's this kind of, it comes through in Guy Madden films, it comes through in the Royal Art Lodge and so on. Like maybe there would have been a place for Gathie in that trajectory in Winnipeg, but I think Vancouver just ended up being that much closer to California. And probably, I think one of the major things for Gathie Falk is simply that she was exposed to what was going on at the Vancouver Art Gallery at this time, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Like for any artist to be exposed to what was happening at the Vancouver Art Gallery gave them an accelerator switch. And so when Gathie and Tom Graff moved east to Toronto, for example, and they showed their performance art pieces in Toronto, people were completely like mystified, like art world insiders were like, what is this? And the reason that they were behind is that the Yvonne Rainer and other, performance artists and experimental dancers from New York had been going to Vancouver to do workshops and so on with the artists there. And as I said, there was a lot of relationship between California, conceptual art and so on, and Vancouver. So those ideas were really fomenting there in a way that I think really catalyzed her development as an artist.
It was a great question. I asked her if I could reveal her identity. It's Gerda Murray, who's with us.
I thought it was you.
A wonderful question. And she mentioned a name that has come up, and someone else mentioned a name that's come up a bit when we talked about Gathie's sort of unique place in the story of Canadian art, Joyce Wieland, as someone who's, kind of against the grain in her setting.
That's right. That's right. And again, kind of detumescent, masculinity too. I mean, Wieland actually literally depicts that, in her works. She's looking at the kind of macho symbolism in the artists around her, and is kind of, in a way, poking fun at it a little bit from the sides. But I also think in a West Coast context, you look at Gathie Falk, and, one of the things that she has in common with an artist like Emily Carr, for example, I mean, Emily Carr is all about going into what she saw as the wild, going into the woods and so on. And Gathie is going into her garden. But what they have in common is this kind of incredible way of connecting with a kind of life force. It's very, very intense. And, I think that there's a way in which you could see them. There's some kind of continuum there as well in terms of permission given.
Well, we've talked about when we've, leading up to opening the show, talking about women who are kind of peerless in their immediate setting. Joyce Wieland is sort of the name that comes up in Ontario, and Mary Pratt will come up also for on the West Coast, and Emily Carr was peerless in her time, and Gathie as well. Yeah. Exactly. Well, we've gone over time because this has been so delightful, but I guess we better wrap up. And I'd just like to say, we planned this show mostly remotely together on screens, and to bring this show together in real life, we're standing in it, having come together, and it was like being in a dream. It was just incredible to see these works gathered in one place. I hope everyone who's here with us tonight, I hope you will come to McMichael and experience it for yourself. You won't regret it. It's I think it will. I'm certain it'll be a revelation to all who come to see us. Buy this book online as a preview, or pick it up after your experience with us. It is a pleasure and a treasure. And
Jen,
please,
do you happen to remember in your brilliant brain when the closing date of this show is?
yes, it is January 2nd.
Okay, so I'm just
So
saying, Christmas present, revelation.
it will be a great Christmas present, but there's lots of time to come over and over and bring your out of town friends as they come through over the next few months. If you're not a member at the McMichael, please join us so that you will get notifications about all the great things that we're doing, and you'll never miss a talk like this. Do come and see us. Thank you, Sarah, for your insights on this show. It has been a real pleasure. And I'll say one more time, thank you to BMO for being linking arms with us on this exhibition, and giving the big support that an exhibition of this scale and caliber requires. We are looking forward to sending the show on to 3 dear friends in our museum landscape in Canada: Museum London, the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, and the O'Dane Art Museum in Whistler. And with that, I guess we should say farewell and adieu.
Night, night, everyone. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. Good night.